Hey everyone, time for South Asia. We got some new viewers out there in Pennsylvania and Michigan, so we're expanding our footprint here in world geography at FSU, but we're continuing on with South Asia. To recap, for all of those of you who are behind, we've covered North and Central South America, we've covered Europe, we've covered all of Africa, and we've covered Southwest Asia, what many folks would call the Middle East, but not us because we now know better. And so South Asia is going to be particular in the sense because it's going to be a subcontinent. And that's exactly what's going to answer my own question when I ask you, what makes South Asia a region? Now, the book, of course, will answer those questions for you, which is why we're doing this. But for all of those out there that's just pondering that, this is the Indian subcontinent. And this plate comes and it merges, it crashes actually, tectonic plate activity, it crashes into the Asian continent, which we know is the largest continent of the world. It crashes in there 60-some million years ago, and this is why this big landmass jets out the way it does. It is Indian subcontinent as we know it. And it also, this area shares a lot of similarities in the sense of it was conquered in the same way, it was explored in the same way, traders came through in the same way, and of course it was colonized largely by the British in the same way. So it has a large, physically speaking, in terms of its geographic identity based on its tectonic activity, it's a shared region. And of course, because of the human patterns over time, the human characteristics and the cultural geography, it's also its own region. So South Asia, here we go, part one, physical geography. Now this one, we know actually if there's any physical geographic principle or feature factor that comes to mind when we think of landforms in South Asia, what should come immediately to mind are those Himalayan mountains, because it's the tallest point in the world, Mount Everest, 29,000 feet, I think about 29,035 feet to be exact, but about 29,035 feet right there. It spoiled it, but about 29,000 feet, highest point from sea level in terms of highest altitude, highest elevation from sea level, Mount Everest, there in the Himalayan mountains, in the country of Nepal, and obviously this area, the Himalayas run through this border region between India, Nepal, Bhutan, and that of China. And you can see the elevation here, it's quite drastic, it's quite different, which creates a really different kind of area in terms of physical geography when you have these low-lying coastal areas, a lot of beaches down here from the movie. Perhaps you watched Outsourced. They have a weekend in Goa. That's a beach community there where people visit. There's a plateaued regions. We have pretty high mountainous regions, not quite as high as the Himalayas, but nowhere else is. But high mountainous regions here like the Hindu Kush up in Afghanistan. Low-lying areas here as well in parts of India, and that's going to obviously be a factor when we discuss the agricultural productivity of the region, specifically that of India. You'll see these areas, and we know our physical geography because we learned that sort of early on. But these low-lying areas also overlap where there's major rivers, and because we know that the rivers over time have created a low-lying area that feed into each other. So this low-lying area here, the Indus River, the Ganga River, and the Brahmaputra River, three most important rivers in this region, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. But for now, we're going to just sort of capture the landforms and the elevation, if you will. Sri Lanka and the Maldives are going to be actually island nations that we'll talk about only briefly because unfortunately they're not as popular as the other countries here, or sort of worth talking about, if you will, although we beg to differ. We think every country is worth talking about to the same extent. But take a look at this delta. That's going to come back to us when we talk about landforms, as well as how this is going to influence the climate. So again, take a note of those low-lying areas as well as those that are quite high, and how that makes it difficult or not difficult to live, if you will. So we know Nepal, almost 29 million people, 28 point some million people living here in Nepal, as we would understand that it'd be quite challenging to live there in comparison to other parts of the world, like that of Afghanistan, and again, parts of Afghanistan that don't have fertile soil and that are in these highland parts, and in contrast to some of these low-lying and friendly areas for agriculture and better climate suited for human life here in other parts of South Asia. Landforms. So let's take that all back. We described that without any words, so here we are. Collision of two tectonic plates. They run into each other 60 million years ago. It causes a crash. When you have these plates come into each other, we have to, the Earth has to go somewhere. It pushes the Earth upward, and we have the Himalayan mountains forming, and this is taking place today. The entire Indian peninsula, including Nepal, Bhutan, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, is this subcontinent that we've discussed. Himalaya is obviously tallest point in the entire world, and these rivers, these three main rivers that are going to be a factor in the physical geography of South Asia: Indus, Ganga, and Brahmaputra. All these rivers is actually quite interesting. All these rivers originate within about 100 miles of each other up in these highland areas, and that's because of glacial melting. We have the snow and ice melting and forming these glacial rivers that then run and feed through the rest of the subcontinent, the rest of this sub-region of South Asia. So that's quite fascinating, within 100 miles of each other. And you remember what I said about things that are quite fascinating. They probably are fascinating enough for an exams. Keep that in mind. So to put these landforms into perspective, we obviously visualize them. We've probably seen photos of Mount Everest at a certain point in time. Again, tallest point in the world in terms of elevation from sea level. The Ganga River, formerly known as the Ganges, if you will, so in India as well as other places, reascribes names to their places. So we have Bombay becomes Bombay becomes Mumbai, Calcutta becomes Kolkata. Spelling difference, not necessarily, you didn't notice much of the pronunciation. The Ganges River becomes the Ganga. And so there's some slight differences there. Don't get confused. That's, going back to the pronunciation of and spelling and names, if you will, that was not assigned to them through British colonial rule. Similar situation to what we saw with those Africanization of names in Belgian Congo, if you remember, when Joseph Desiré Mobutu, or Mobutu Sese Seko, went and changed all the names around. Something similar took place here, a less dramatic way, if you will. But again, the Ganges Delta seen here, but the Ganga Brahmaputra Delta, largest delta in the world, and it's going to have an immense impact on the way of living for the Bangladeshi people, and it's going to be quite interesting when we talk about it more. There's Western and Eastern Ghats mountains. In India, we talked about orographic rainfall. That takes place in India specifically. Hindu Kush Mountains, and these mountain ranges divided the country of Afghanistan into sort of three geographic areas that are defined in the book. And then with that, we'll move on to discuss climate. So you should have been reading about all this interesting stuff, but in recaps here, wet tropical, you'll see, dominates the country of Bangladesh, and that's going to be due to the way air and oceanographic patterns, but I'm jumping ahead on myself, so I'm going to hold myself back. I'm just too excited. Tropical, wet, and dry, and that's going to be dominated by those monsoon seasons that the book talks about, when we have a summer and winter monsoon, and therefore a wet and a dry, respectively, season that takes place. But let's sort of keep this in mind. So we have a little bit of highlands, okay? Makes sense because this is quite high, and the highland regions are areas of these Himalayan peaks and the Himalayan mountains seen here. Okay, we're breaking it down. It's going pretty well. Humid subtropical, if you remember, these are places that are like southeastern United States, southeastern Brazil, but we could probably picture that because we know what southeastern United States looks like because we're here right now, or at least you should be within reason in the Florida area. We know what that kind of climate is like. Now, the climate can vary a bit from region to region in terms of flora and fauna, but we sort of have an idea of what kind of rainfall to expect and what sort of temperature fluctuations to expect in humid subtropical. Now that brings us to semi-arid and arid. Semi-arid being semi that of arid. Arid is drier, and obviously semi-arid is not quite as dry. You can see Most of northwestern India and Pakistan are arid regions, and that being said, then Afghanistan being semi-arid. And that leaves us with the tropical wet, which is just parts of western and southwestern India and most of Bangladesh. And now we'll talk just a bit about some of these through some text. So again, back to the tectonic plate activity. Because of that crash and because of that movement that still takes place today, it leaves the region very susceptible to earthquakes and tsunamis. Tsunamis being tidal waves, if you will. And especially deadly years that were highlighted in the textbook were 01, 04, 5, and 15. 2004, most deadly, about 54,000 people in South Asia died as a result, mainly in southeastern India and Sri Lanka, mostly Sri Lanka, in the South Asian region. Now that's 54,000 about there. 230,000 are coming from deaths in Southeast Asia, which is going to be our next, well, not even our next chapter, but 2 chapters away. So table that, and we'll come back to it. It was very devastating in 2004. 2015 was an earthquake that claimed about 8,000 lives in that of Nepal, probably still fresh in your mind. And the climate is dominated by the winds. Remember, we talked before about trade winds and stuff from the equator. Now, we're a bit north of the equator in this case, but that's still not to be said that we're not in the ITCZ, the Intertropical Convergence Zone, and we've talked about that before several times, so you should be remembering that. We talked about it in South America, and we talked about it in Africa, so at this point it should just be common. So therefore, when those winds take place and then when they reverse course, that leaves us with a wet and a dry season. In this case, it's a wet summer monsoon and a dry winter. That's a winter monsoon. And Darjeeling, India holds the world record for rainfall at 35 feet. This is where the fun fact comes in. With no rainfall for half of the year. So that's how intense this rainfall takes place. Let's try to get that into our minds, that that's a lot of rain. But that only rains there half of the year. So to understand how much rain comes in those times of wet times, it is quite prolific in terms of the amount of rainfall. So we're jumping into the environment. And this environment breaks it down, organizes this by environment in relation to vulnerability to climate change. And this area is quite vulnerable. So the primary danger of droughts and flooding, and we're talking about two opposite things, droughts in terms of dryness and flooding, the overabundance of water, is the ability for them to destroy harvests. Okay, so what is the best way to prevent destroyed harvests via drought? And that would be irrigation. If you didn't answer that out loud to yourself, or you just paused to wait for me to give you that answer. And so that's irrigation. However, we've talked about types of irrigation. We've talked about drip irrigation in certain parts of the world, and we know that's quite efficient. We know that the Israelis perfected that in the Middle East. I wouldn't maybe go as far as saying perfected, but they've used that, and among other places, they're not the only nation or country, if you will, but we talked about it there. However, in this place, ditches account for most of the irrigation techniques in the region. And like I said, drip irrigation more effective. Unfortunately, ditch requires a lot more water, and so that's not exactly great. And so problems with ditches, requirement of more water, upwards of 97% in some cases, and that salinization of the soil, so that buildup of salt residue. And again, not great when you're trying to grow something. So again, drought and flooding, opposites, either too little or too much water at a particular point in time, but obviously devastating for your crops and for your yield. No yield, no food. No food, no money, or no food, no life. So again, very important. Glacial melting, okay. Because of the 3 major rivers in the region, which were the Indus, the Ganga, and the Brahmaputra, because they're fed by glaciers and glacial melting, melting is of great concern. Now, some of that melting is natural, okay, of course. This is something that's been taking place over the period of time, that this routine snowfall and this routine melt, that comes off is normal. But because of climate change and we see this melting taking place at increased rates, which is obviously not good because the immediate effect then, therefore, of glacial melting is flooding. However, the long term then would be no water at all, or of course reduced amount of water. So the immediate impact of glacial melting is, we have this ice up there, ice and glacial compact. That's melting. We have a flood of water downstream. Makes sense. When that ice melts and doesn't return because it's happening at such a quick rate, we don't have any water or very little water coming back. And what so happens, even at this point, we're seeing areas where glaciers are melting and beginning to disappear. Rivers are running drier and drier in winter or those dry months. And at some point, maybe will be dry, but at this point, they're becoming increasingly dry and eliminating a water supply of about 703 million people, about half of the population of this entire region that we're talking about is South Asia. So again, not so good. This entire section will be a bit grim in the case that we're talking about vulnerability to climate change, and this region is quite vulnerable due to the physical geography and their ability to cope with it in terms of political and economic willpower. Sea level rise. Well, we talked about sea level rise a lot of places. This area, no different. What country has a population of 165 million people living in an area the size of Iowa? Answer, Bangladesh. And if you know Iowa, which you may not, it's not exactly the most exciting state in the United States, known for farming and that breadbasket, if you will. We said breadbasket about 1 million times when we covered those regions, but Iowa has about a population of 3.1 million people. So we have a ton more people here packed in that same kind of space. It's a very densely populated country as pictured here. So what to do? So these places, of course, areas, again, that have a little bit more money and political will can start building man-made infrastructure adjustments like dikes and levees and other structures to prevent sea level rise, or at least to curb the influence of sea level rise, because it is, of course, occurring. There's more natural ways of combating that through mangroves, the tree, of course, that can help mitigate sea level rise in areas where mangroves can flourish, this case being it again. And we have places like the Maldives especially, and other coastal areas that are threatened by sea level rise just because of because they're so close to sea level. Major cities such as Dhaka, Bangladesh, Mumbai, Kolkata in India, and Karachi, and among others, are threatened due to sea level rise. And again, these are pretty open shut cases. We're not a lot of interpretation here. We know what the impacts are, and we know what's happening. Now here, water scarcity and conflict. This is going to hit a little close to home. So the region is home to about 20% of the world's population, but only 4% the global supply of fresh water. Well, the numbers just don't add up. It's pretty easy. We know water scarcity is the lack of access to water, and so that's an issue that does perpetuate conflict in the region. And so the example here in the book, there was actually more than one example, but the most striking example was this Tista River. And so what happens there? Okay, well, there in the 1970s, there's some discussions here, and we're sharing the river between countries, India and Bangladesh. These are countries that are situated right beside each other. It starts in India and it flows into Bangladesh, so they're on the that end of the negotiation. And so at that point in time, so we're talking decades ago, upwards of 40 plus years into the 1970s and onward. This isn't something that's stagnant in the 1970s and onward. This is a continuing negotiation. That river was shared 39% to 36%, 39% being India, 36% being Bangladesh. You say, where's the other numbers? Well, 25% being left for the natural ecological prospects of the river. So that for the natural ecology and the biodiversity of the river, to protect the river itself, to allow the river not to be harmed, they believed keep a certain amount of water in that river system. So that's where we were at that point in time. Now that looks, and beyond, that looks now to be 85% India, 15% Bangladesh, and now you say, for all of you quick mathematicians out there, that doesn't leave us any water left for the natural ecology and biodiversity of the river. No, it doesn't. And so that's where we are now. There's water negotiations taking place. Who knows what will take place, because we're not in that moment right now, but it's forthcoming. Probably anywhere that the river begins and the country that has more buying power. And that's what this boils down to. India versus Bangladesh on the world stage and in the region. It's not really a competition in the sense of the political power and the economic forces that India brings to the table that Bangladesh simply cannot compete with. So India dominates the water. This sounds a little bit familiar, and it should. We have the Tri-State Water War, or the Tri-State Water Dispute that we discussed from the Apalachicola, Chattahoochee, and Flint Basin, the ACF, that's coming from the Georgia and coming down into Florida and Alabama, and it's drying up less and less is coming to us with that growth up in Georgia. Similar things taking place, although the consequences are a bit more dire here in this part of the world. We have some people really relying on it here, but most water scarce in this region of South Asia would be Afghanistan, and then Pakistan, and then Northwest India, as indicated by that climate map that we saw a few slides back. Rising per capita use and water pollution. So we're continuing on here with climate change vulnerability and environmental issues. And we have, as the standard of living continues to rise, water consumption rises or increases. And that's not too complicated. What is the most effective way to expand water resources in this region? Well, that would be to curb the amount of water pollution that's taking place. There's actually quite a bit of water in some of these places, but that water that is there can't be used because it's too polluted. And so that's one way to curb this issue, especially when sometimes water is scarce or non-existent. It's good that when you do have water that you can use it. Here's a little fact. It's not fun. 17 five-star hotels daily use the same amount of water as 42,000 people in Delhi's slums. Delhi being a major city and capital of India. So there you are. These hotels accommodate Westerners, those from Europe and the like, and these fancy hotels, and they're coming and sucking the water out of the area and using far more than a lot of locals who are in need of the water. Virtual water and exports. We talked about virtual water before, water footprints and all those likes. Major exports include rice, cotton, and clothing. Well, if you remember what virtual water was the amount of water that it requires into a product in the product's entire life course, if you will. Rice is water intensive. India is the #1 rice producer in the world, #2 cotton producer in the world, and 50% of 50% of the Indian workforce comes from agriculture. So the economy in the region rests on water-dependent endeavors. They need to sort of shake that dependence, if you will, because again, water scarcity is increasing. However, population and need of water also increasing, and so at a certain point, there will need to be some innovations or some cutbacks or some just other ways to adapt to this situation based on water scarcity and immense increases in terms of demand. Deforestation. Now we remember deforestation. I don't know why I kind of said it with excitement. It's not a good topic. But deforestation, what happened as forests vanished in the northwest region of South Asia, of the subcontinent, India to Afghanistan. So what happened? Well, it's become increasingly drier. And so that affects a lot of ecological properties of the land. It's increased soil erosion, of course. It's become a drier region. It's become more inhospitable to live in and to grow in, in terms of agricultural aspects of things. So deforestation, obviously never a good thing in these cases when we bring it up. Logging and deforestation continues in the region. Back in the mid-1800s, when we were in the prime of British colonization in the region, about 1 million trees were felled every year to make room for transportation and this part of the British Empire that was in what we now know as India, or what was British India. With less trees, greater levels of erosion take place, which was created stronger and more frequent land and mudslides. Okay, we've already talked about that, but I do want to reiterate that because that's kind of an important point. The Chipko movement comes. So this is kind of sad. Deforestation, it's not good, but it's taking place, and you say, wow, shame on them, pointing fingers and things like that. There's actually not quite only that being that black and white, if you will. There's a bit of gray area in the sense of, well, it is black and white in that sense, but it's not so clear because there's environmental movements and activists that are there and they are present in that fight. One being the Chipko movement, which translates into hugging, literally tree huggers. When some areas of trees were meant to be demolished, woman was hugging the trees, and so in order to not let them be demolished, and this idea of tree hugging and this movement takes place there. And so again, there is optimism for this movement because we have activists there fighting for their local ecology and local physical geography and their local forests. Air pollution. Of all regions in the world, South Asia has the worst air pollution. Air pollution related illnesses are the 5th leading cause of death in India, and this book talks about the Asian brown cloud. So what is it? What is the Asian brown cloud? And if you haven't gotten why I'm asking these questions and why I'm not putting it up on the slides, is I'm actually forcing you to listen and watch these videos and not just simply bring them up and copy and paste, if you will. So you're going to have to listen to these. You're going to have to move with us in terms of this review. You're doing this work independently, but you're going to have to move with us and actually take notes. So you're probably fuming at this point. But what is the Asian brown cloud? So here it is. It can be seen from space, so that's pretty cool. I would argue that could be considered a fun fact if it wasn't so damaging. Because this is produced from burning fuel wood, agricultural byproducts and waste, animal dung, in the name of on cook stoves and cooking for, not so much for heat in the case, but in terms of cooking and on these cook stoves, the burning of all these products that can be found in rural South Asia in these small communities that are dotted throughout the entire area. And that's producing the Asian brown cloud, which is, again, not good for the environment nor humans, of course. That actually wraps up part 1 of South Asia.